I like John Cage's ideas, but I don't want to listen to the music. If you've ever had this thought, this video is for you. John Cage was a prodigious inventor who had insane imaginative powers and an intense spirit of openness and freshness in his work. So what's not to like? Nevertheless, audiences remain sharply divided by his music, some considering Cage to be a charlatan, not even a musician at all. In this video, I'm going to make a case for what I think is his most beautiful piece, the Concerto for Prepared Piano and Chamber Orchestra. If you stick around to the end of the video, I'm also going to reveal my own favorite moment from the entire score, and I think it's going to surprise you. First, I just want to quickly say that we're getting really close to 50,000 subscribers on this channel, which is absolutely amazing. I would never have imagined that we would be there. So if you want to help us get to this amazing goal, all you have to do is hit the subscribe button and also the notification bell to make sure you find out as soon as I publish new content on this channel. I'm going to start out by just providing a bit of context about this piece. So the Concerto for Prepared Piano and Chamber Orchestra was composed in 1950 to 1951, and it is really a pivotal work in John Cage's output as a whole. So up until that point, John Cage, of course, he had invented his own techniques and he'd invented some technical devices that were really his, but you couldn't really say that his work was a radical departure from what other people were also doing at the same time. In the Concerto for Prepared Piano and Chamber Orchestra, that starts to change, and this is the first piece of a period that would develop throughout the 1950s, in which he's starting to incorporate more and more chance elements into his music. And by chance, I mean he's deliberately relinquishing control of the elements that go into a musical composition. And there's a bunch of ways you can do that, of course. You can write graphic scores in which the pitches and the rhythms are not precisely notated, but the performer has to fill in that information. You can also write scores in which compositional decisions are delegated to literally a toss of the dice, or consulting the I Ching, or writing down the imperfections on a piece of music paper, and that's where the notes are going to go, that sort of thing. So as the 50s wear on, Cage gets more and more involved in that sort of thing, and less involved in his own personal decision-making when it comes to making a piece. Of course, he's setting the parameters of the piece as a whole. He's designing the process that the performer is going to have to follow in order to realize the work, but nevertheless, he's not really involved in picking specific timbres, colors, orchestrations, notes, rhythms, and so on in the way that he was before. In this concerto, we're really midway between those two periods. So there are lots of elements, much of the sort of friendlier elements of his earlier music. A lot of the harmony in this piece is actually diatonic or pandiatonic. The rhythms, well, there's lots of iterative rhythmic patterns that are very simple and very appealing. But at the same time, he's starting to incorporate elements that are taking him away from, deciding every aspect of the piece himself. So we're going to have a look at how that happened and why this is such an important piece in Cage's output. In many respects, this is a very conventional concerto, and that might be surprising coming from John Cage. But if you look at it, it's a 3-movement work, absolutely prototypical concerto form, and it starts with an instrumental introduction by the orchestra, followed by an introduction by the pianist, and it's even got cadenzas. It's got solo cadenzas where the pianist can show off their virtuosity. But it's a kind of limited virtuosity, of course, but it's a virtuosity nevertheless. And so in many respects, he sticks actually pretty closely to the template of the classical concerto in this piece, which is rather surprising. The other thing that this piece does that I think is really interesting is, because of the nature of the prepared piano, and we're going to get into that in a minute, the piece incorporates a lot of noise elements. So we certainly have standard pitched orchestral sounds, but we also have sounds that can only be described as unpitched noises. The Concerto for Prepared Piano and Chamber Orchestra is written for the soloist, plus a small orchestra of 24 players. So this orchestra includes 7 wind instruments for percussion, celesta, orchestral piano, harp, and string quintet. Now, we notice immediately that the percussion battery is gigantic. There's almost 50 different instruments used in the percussion section, including some electronic sound sources, such as a radio, a recording of a generator, and an amplified coil of wire. So, there's an absolute equivalence in this piece of noise elements and pitched elements. Cage treats them in the same way. And I think that's very typical of his work in general. He's asking us to expand our range of what might be considered to be a musical experience and a musical sound. A prepared piano is an ordinary piano that has been modified through the use of various implements, either stuck on the strings or stuck in between the strings. And this can be pieces of wood, it can be screws, it can be pieces of rubber. And what this does is it modifies the timbre of the instrument. It modifies its attack and resonance characteristics, and also the sound. And so by preparing a piano with these various implements, you can end up with something that really sounds like a miniature percussion orchestra. So in the case of this particular piece, the piano preparation is really extensive. There are no fewer than 53 individual prepared strings, each of them prepared differently, so that you get 53 completely different sounds on the instrument. So one of the things about John Cage that you inevitably see when people discuss his work and try to analyze it is a discussion of the process by which a piece was made. Now, Cage is very explicit about this. He talks about it quite a lot in his writings. Commentators on Cage always bring this up. And it's interesting because it gives you some anecdotal information on how it was he was working and how it was that he arrived at these strange sound worlds. So let's just briefly look at how that happened in the context of this piece. So this piece was written with a few procedures that certainly could be described as unusual. So when we open up the score, we see immediately that all the score pages are laid out in an identical fashion. 8 bars per page, laid out in a regular grid, 3 centimeters wide for every bar. So what that tells us is Cage must have started his compositional process by ruling off all the bar lines on his staff paper. The second thing he did was he created what he called a gamut of sounds, or a chart with various orchestral sonic possibilities on it. So these sounds would be pitches or noises without any particular duration. So let's say an F sharp on the oboe, followed by a 3-note chord played by violin, viola, and trombone, etc. So really, really specifically notated sounds with dynamics, with timbral indications, everything you need, but no duration and no particular order. So Cage describes this process of selecting sounds for his orchestral material as being like walking along a beach and selecting different pebbles that you like and then arranging them at home later on. So this is very much how he was working in this piece. There's no particular sense of continuity or any sense of how these materials might actually fit together. They're simply sounds that he likes. Now, the next thing he did, and this is actually quite typical of early Cage, he was doing this in the 1940s and well into the 1950s, is his use of what he called a rhythmic structure. So a rhythmic structure, according to Cage, is a series of numbers that will determine both the local proportions and the large-scale proportions of a piece as a whole. The idea being that you can use these numbers to control the micro scale and the macro scale of the piece. Cage thought of this as being a kind of a fractal idea. I don't exactly see it that way, but let's give the devil his due. Let's talk about how this works. So in the case of the Concerto for Prepared Piano and Chamber Orchestra, Cage starts with the numbers 3, 2, 4, 4, 2, 3, 5, grouped into 3 sections of numbers. So if you add all of those numbers up, you get 23. What this means is the concerto is articulated in sections of 23 bars, and those sections of 23 bars are further articulated, subdivided into smaller groups of phrases, 3 bars long, 2 bars long, 4 bars long, and so on. Now, this also gives us the form of the piece as a whole. The form of the piece as a whole consists of 23 times these 23 bar sections. Now, those 23 times 23 sections are then divided into 3 movements according to the subgroupings that we looked at earlier. So 3, 2, 4, 4, 2, 3, and 5. So that means the first 2 movements of the piece are of identical duration, and the third movement is about half the length of the first 2. So I've just described some of the ways that this piece was written, the gamut technique, the chart that he used, laying out all of these orchestral sounds, and the rhythmic structure. I have to point out, though, that there's a problem here. So very often when musicologists, when analysts, when people try to figure out a 20th or a 21st century composition, one of the first things they do is they look at the sketches, they look at the composer's own statements about how the piece was made, and they rely on that, and they present those things as though that constituted a form of analysis, or as though it helped us necessarily to understand the work itself. Sometimes it does help, but often it doesn't, because there's no necessary one-to-one connection between the process by which something was made and what it is that we actually hear. So it can be anecdotally interesting to talk about these things, but it doesn't always actually tell you anything about what the piece means, what it says, how it operates upon our perceptual faculties. In the case of this particular work, I've just described this subdivision into sections, movements, and phrases, but the truth is when you're listening to the piece, much of this is completely inaudible. So I'm not actually sure how useful it is to even talk about this technique, because let's say that we have a phrase of 3 bars followed by a phrase of 2 bars followed by a phrase of 4 bars. When you look at the score, again, the rehearsal numbers that Cage indicates, 3, 4, 5, etc., in the score, correspond to these divisions into phrases. So you'll have a rehearsal number that lasts for 3 bars and then one that lasts for 2 and so on. And these rehearsal numbers are separated by double bar lines, indicating some kind of a formal articulation in the piece. The truth is, however, this formal articulation is completely inaudible. If you don't have the score in front of your eyes, there's no way of knowing that that's what's going on here. Because often he'll tie events across section double bar lines, or it'll be the same exact texture continuing across the section break. Sometimes, to be fair, there is in fact a notable change of texture from one section to the next, but just as often there isn't any. So what I suspect is these devices that Cage was using were a way for him of simplifying the task of composing. And there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Lots of composers work that way. It's how we get our notes on the page sometimes. In other words, when you're writing a piece, you don't necessarily want to be confronted with 100,000 possible decisions that you're making at every moment. You want some decisions to be automated. You just don't have to think about them. So I think with this rhythmic structure idea, what Cage is really doing is he's setting aside these little amounts of time. It's like if you want to make a dress, then you have to cut off a certain amount of fabric so that you kind of know what the dimensions are that you're working in. I think it's the same with this. The difference, though, is that while it may have been useful for his compositional process, it doesn't necessarily mean anything for the listener, at least not in this particular piece. So we talked about the gamut, or the chart of orchestral sounds that Cage used when he was composing this piece. I want to just briefly look at the first couple of pages of the score so you can see what those materials look like and how they're laid out. So here I've made a reduction of the score on 2 staves plus a percussion staff and a top staff that shows you the underlying rhythmic structure. In other words, where do the pulses lie within this invariant meter of 2/2. Now notice here also that the meter and the tempo in this piece never change, not even from one movement to the next. So if we look at page 1 here, you can see we start with some actually fairly consonant sounds. In fact, the first thing we hear is a D minor triad played by a violin, a clarinet, and a horn. Next we hear an F sharp played by a trombone and held for 5 beats. Then a high D played on a clarinet, and a 4-note chord played by oboe, violin, bassoon, and trumpet. Now, so far, if you're just looking at this score and you didn't know it was by John Cage, you'd say, wait a minute, this is like a piece in D major or a D minor. Like it's pretty consonant most of the time. And it's true that in keeping with a lot of his early music, Cage often keeps himself to a relatively friendly vocabulary of diatonic fragments, pendiatonic chords, with the occasional cluster and the occasional noise element. But we're not really in atonal territory here. This is not Schoenberg. This is not Weber. This is a different approach. So next we have another 4-note chord played on 2 timpani, a bassoon, and an oboe. And you can see that all of the different instrumental combinations here are completely different. And they're all really transparent, so that generally speaking, you can hear every single individual pitch. And a lot of the time, these individual pitches are played by different instruments. So you get all of these constantly changing kaleidoscopic variations on a sound. Moving forward, we have a double bass, C sharp, played pizzicato, held for one beat, another 3-note chord, a G held on the English horn, and so on. We have a little complicated string chord here, followed by a little harp gesture, a little 6-note gesture on the harp. So if you look at all of these different sound events that take place in the orchestra, first of all, there's no particular connection between any of them, no sense of voice leading, continuity, phrase, melody, any of that. These are just isolated monads, individual sounds that have been chosen by Cage and then placed more or less fortuitously next to one another. You can divide them up into simple categories. So these sounds consist of aggregates, groups of pitches, single pitches, gestures, and noises with the addition of percussion sounds. So there's 4 basic categories of sound. Where does that idea come from? Well, it comes directly from the prepared piano. Remember that a prepared piano can produce unpitched noises, it can produce specific pitches, it can produce intervals, it can do all sorts of things. And the other thing about the prepared piano is you press a key on the keyboard, an F sharp that's been prepared. Every time you press that key, you get the same preparation sound, you get the same unusual sort of percussive / pianistic timbre. It's the same in the orchestra. The orchestra is considered in this piece like a kind of gigantic keyboard with all of these different sound combinations, and they never change, right? So every time you press this key on the orchestra, you get that same 4-note chord with oboe, flute, clarinet, or trombone, or whatever it is. So what Cage did was, once he had created this chart of all of these different orchestral sounds, he read the chart in various directions, clockwise, counterclockwise, in some kind of a zigzag shape. He had various patterns that he would follow while reading the chart, and that would give him the final order of events in the orchestral score. So I think what's cool about this is that, again, there's no particular connection between events in this piece. Sometimes you have what sounds like a 3 or 4-note phrase in the orchestra with a bunch of adjacent pitches are slurred together. This is fortuitous. It just happens that when he was reading his chart, those 3 events with relatively continuous notes happen to follow one another, and he joins them together with a slur. But there's no particular melodic or phrasal or structural intention behind that. It's simply what the chart happened to reveal. There's one other aspect of this piece that I think is really important that we've touched upon briefly, but there's a complete clear division of labor in this piece between what the soloist does and what the orchestra does, but that relationship is not stable. It changes over the course of the work. So, in the first movement of the piece, most of the time when the soloist is playing, the orchestra is silent. So they alternate. Orchestra, soloist, orchestra, soloist. Sometimes there's a little bit of overlap, but generally speaking, that's how the first movement is articulated. And these 2 worlds are really separate from each other. So the orchestral material, this sort of succession of notes and chords, timbres and noises, is played in this sort of relatively indifferent manner without any real sense of expression or phrase or anything like that. It's just interesting sounds that you can listen to. The soloist part, on the other hand, is much more continuous. So it uses rhythmic ostinati that are continuous, and it also uses melodic ideas and gestures that have much more of a sense of expressivity to them, of flexibility, of phrasing. So there's a clear separation between these 2 worlds, the expressive, nuanced, spontaneous, improvised world of the soloist, and this sort of objective, like a kind of a museum display piece of, behind glass, of a bunch of sounds played in an orchestra, which is what we get in the ensemble playing. As the piece continues, this initial contradiction between what the soloist is doing and what the orchestra is doing starts to break down. Already in the second movement, we can see that the soloist is starting to behave a little bit more like the orchestra. We start to see that there are actually little sounds that are being repeated. Remember that in the orchestra part, when he's reading his gamut or his chart, he's going to repeat some of the sounds occasionally. Like there's a little clarinet gesture, 2 grace notes followed by a long held note. We hear that sound 5 or 6 times over the course of the piece. Just based on how he happens to be reading his chart, some of the sounds are bound to reappear. So that happens in the soloist's part in the second movement, where you start to hear little chunks of the solo part being repeated. So the most obvious change there is that the texture gets more and more sparse. There's more and more silence being introduced into the piece. but also the soloist's interjections become shorter and shorter, sometimes just a single bar or a single chord, and we're quickly alternating between the orchestra and the soloist. So the idea really, according to Cage, is that there's an increasing sense of equivalence between what the soloist is doing and what the orchestra is doing. They become more and more integrated with each other as the piece wears on. I said at the beginning of this video I was going to reveal my favorite moment in the piece, so here it is. Right before the end, there's this completely ludicrous bassoon cadenza, and it's the only time that this sound appears in the whole piece. It's very, very peculiar. Now remember, the tempo here is half note equals 54, so that means that this one bar at 2-2 is going to last for just about 2 seconds. Now look what the bassoonist has to do. This little cadenza covers the entire range of the instrument from the low B flat up to an altissimo D. In addition to that, there's a huge number of notes that have to be played in 2 seconds, and every single one of them practically has a different dynamic marking. So this is like really acrobatic. It's really on the edge of what a bassoonist can possibly technically do. And when you compare different recordings of the piece, you can see that it's always pretty approximate, because this is, again, this is really on the edge of what's even technically possible. And this is very much a deliberate choice on the part of Cage. It's part of the reason why I find this piece so charming, is because he deliberately puts things in the score that he knows are technically impossible to play. But what he's interested in is what happens when you try. What happens when you try to do something that's impossible and you fail, but you really try? It's like, well, you get a gesture that you could not possibly have obtained otherwise. Let's imagine a different scenario. Imagine that you're trying to do something, it's really difficult, but it's possible. You work and work and work at it, and you eventually master it, and then you can do it. Like, for example, the bassoonist that had to play the solo at the beginning of The Rite of Spring. Okay, that's a really challenging solo, especially if it's 1913 and you're a bassoonist and you've never had to do anything like that before. This is different. This little 2-second thing here is not really masterable in that sense. You're always going to fail. You're always going to not quite do what Cage is asking you to do, but you're going to end up with a complex gesture that you would not have been able to obtain otherwise. And decades later, composers such as Brian Ferneyhough would take this idea even farther in works like Unity Capsule for solo flute, where he's deliberately overstepping the bounds of what is possible, presenting the soloist with way too much detailed information, forcing them to choose what they're going to focus on, how they're going to convert this barrage of information into a single gesture. At its best, the music of John Cage can make you feel the excitement of endless fresh possibilities. But not all of the pieces are equal. Often, the pieces are set up in such a manner that the composer literally cannot fail, because they're set up in the manner of an experiment. In other words, this is the process, here's what we're going to do, we're going to try this, and then whatever happens, we must accept. Whatever happens, as long as the performer is making a sincere attempt to realize the notation provided by Cage, we have to accept that as a realization of a John Cage work. The problem there is, it makes it impossible really to evaluate the pieces, to say, this one's more interesting than this one, this is a successful work, this is an unsuccessful work, and the truth is, they're not all equal. So one of the problems I have with Cage scholarship in general is he's very often treated like a kind of a guru whose every scrap of paper must be venerated. And there's no denying that Cage was a creative genius. He was an extraordinary figure. And of course we should take his work seriously. But it's very important also to mention that his works are not all equal. And I think it's important to maintain a sense of critical distance when evaluating his pieces and accepting the fact that, yes, some of them are brilliant pieces and some of them are not. Some of them are tedious to listen to. Some of them are really boring. And that's okay. I think it's in the spirit of John Cage and his work to approach his work in that same sense of openness, of saying, okay, we'll listen and we'll decide for ourselves if we want to keep on with this experience or not. But I have to say, the strong pieces are really strong. Nobody else could have written this concerto for prepared piano and chamber orchestra. It's a wonderful piece. You have all of these incredibly interesting sounds. The process by which the piece was made results in a genuinely new sort of sound world. And it's engaging from beginning to end, I believe. And just the sound of it is so gorgeous with this prepared piano that sounds sometimes like a gong, sometimes like a gamelan orchestra, sometimes like a percussion instrument that you can't identify, and sometimes with subtle mixtures of normal piano tones and prepared piano tones. It's just so beautiful. And then all of these incredibly interesting orchestral textures. So I love this piece. I hope you will too, and I certainly encourage everybody to listen to the piece multiple times and not just this video, because you got to hear this piece. It's really something. Now, before we go, one more thing. You can join our vibrant community on Patreon. Patrons of the Samuel Andreev channel and podcast can submit questions of my interview guests, can submit questions for Q&A videos, and can also submit their scores for Calls for Scores, which is something I'm starting to do now. In addition to that, of course, you can get books, you can get CDs, you can get personal conversations on Zoom, composition lessons, analysis lessons. All of this and more is available when you sign up at www.patreon.com/Samuel Andreev. Thanks for watching.